So hello again, everyone, and welcome to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast. And can you believe it, Debra? This is episode 30.
No way. Oh my God, what the hell have we had to chunter about for 30 episodes, Peter?
30 episodes means that we have chatted to one another for at least 15 hours in the last 6 months, which we probably didn't do over the previous 6 years. The only exchanges we have was, we must have lunch sometime. We must catch up. And here we are, chatting away.
I like it, though. I like it. You know, I get a lot out of this. You know, I get different perspectives and learn different things. And also, because we're both having to think about what to discuss, I'm sort of thinking about stuff more. So, you know, if it's no use to anybody else, I'm finding it very helpful.
Well, I like the idea of kind of broadcasting my thoughts on this, that, and the other. Again, it makes me feel a little bit better, and people may or may not be interested. It's nice if they are, and we have had some really lovely feedback from lots of people I kind of admire and respect. So all good.
All good, Peter. All good.
So what's on your mind this week?
Well, I've got a couple of things on my mind this week, actually. One that I'm really interested in your view about. So listeners, Peter will know who I'm talking about, but for those of you who don't know, there's a charity called the Institute of Economic Affairs, which has acted a bit like a thorn in the side of many people in our sector, because they are frequently accused of effectively operating out with charity law. So they appear to be very political. They're not open about where they get funding from. It's not clear that they're necessarily independent. And they've been criticised a lot over time by various commentators in the sector. Anyway, there was pressure put on them at the Charity Commission a few years ago to have a look at the IEA, and they didn't. But, you know, they said there wasn't a problem. But now the Good Law Project have put pressure on the Commission to say you really have to investigate the Institute of Economic Affairs and see if they are in fact complying with charity law. And the areas that they're concerned about is political activity. So they're alleging that the IEA has a very strong right-wing bias, actually, potentially breaking the rules about political activity and campaigning. There are also questions about the transparency of its funding. So where does it get its funding from? It's very difficult to find out. And there's worries that funding might be influencing, inappropriately influencing the decisions of the trustees in the charity. There's questions about whether it's fulfilling its charitable purpose about education, because education is a broad thing. And generally speaking, you're not supposed to have one narrow field of it. And so they're saying that they're just promoting one world view. Are they in breach of that? And then also the question about how independent they are from other bodies. I already mentioned funds. So those are the key challenges to the IEA. And if they are breaking any of those rules, then clearly action needs to be taken by the Commission. But it got me thinking, Peter, more about the law around charities campaigning politically, because it's very clear, it's written down, we're not allowed to do it. There are particular boundaries as well. We're particularly not allowed to say anything. I think it's in the 6 weeks leading up to a general election. And that applies to every charity, regardless of what work you're involved in. You can say what you think about an issue, but you cannot be seen to obviously be favouring or promoting one political party or one particular individual over another. But businesses can. So businesses are absolutely allowed to be political. They can support and sponsor individual candidates to be MP. They can fund political parties. They can speak out publicly on what they think about political issues without any comeback whatsoever. And it's always struck me as odd and a little unfair that charities that are actually working at the hard end of trying to resolve really deep societal issues, which can only be resolved by politics in most instances. If you want to solve the causes of stuff, most of the time you require politicians to take action, that we're not allowed to do it. And I've always wondered why. And I've always had this big question about, is that actually fair and is it right? I don't know, Peter. What do you think?
Wow, we could have a good discussion about that, I think. The world is highly political, isn't it? And charities are highly political in their activities, and the issues and the causes which they campaign for are very political. Last week, we were talking about, I can't remember quite what we were talking about, but I was feeling, thank goodness for charities, because I don't want to be a party political person. The things which I care about are almost bigger and beyond party politics. And so for those people who want to take a side in party politics and, you know, bang the drum and make compromises on some issues for the purpose of furthering that political agenda, well, that's fine. If they want to give their time and money to a political party, do that. I want to give my time and money to changing the world to be a better place as I see it in relation to particular issues which transcend party politics, for me, are kind of bigger and even more important. Now, if we got to a point where the government of the day had an absolute coincidence with my view as to what needed to be done to prevent all cruelty to children, to take an obvious example, then that would be marvellous. And I suppose then one would say, well, are you party political? Because there is this coincidence between the political party and everything you ask for. But I think it's highly unlikely. So but some of this also comes from, 20 years as a civil servant. I'm very comfortable about being in that space where thinking about issues as opposed to aligning up with particular teams to go from one position to another. So I am, on your second question, comfortable about not being allowed to do it. Don't quite know where it comes from. You're right. There's a bit of inconsistency there.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly if your position is always very clear and it just happens at some point in time to coincide with the position of a political party, you're fine, actually. You're not in trouble for that. And we're allowed to make comments about issues. What we're not allowed to do is promote or encourage people to vote for the party that's going to deliver on our issue, which, again, I just find puzzling. If your issue is about, for example, preventing cruelty to children, and there is one particular political party that's got that top of their manifesto, that's absolutely what they're determined to do, and that's what they want to get votes on, you're not allowed, as the NSPCC, to tell anybody that, or to say this is the party that most closely reflects, because that would be in breach of charity law. And it just, again, I can't say I'm standing in the question with this.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, I think, when people donate to charities, they're donating for the work, but then, so do they really want us to be involved in politics? But on the other hand, in charities, you can't possibly, as you said quite, really beautifully, Peter, we operate in a political environment because every problem we're facing has politics in it in some way, shape or form. But we're not allowed to, promote those organisations or those people who are on our side, as it were, on whatever our particular issue is. So I'm kind of twixt and twither about it. I mean, this is one I'd be super interested in, listeners saying what they think, because it's a tough one. It feels to me fundamentally unfair. So there's a part of me that says, well, if we're not allowed to do it, then neither should businesses be allowed to do it. And also I think we've talked before about, I have a view anyway that political parties shouldn't be able to raise money from the public. They should, we should have pots of money. This is how much you're allowed, and off you go and crack on with it, because otherwise, money, well, we see this in the States, don't you? The richer you are, the more likely you are to win your elections. So I have, queries about that sort of thing. But it just seems unfair.
I would be much more comfortable personally about businesses not being allowed to do it, as well as charities not being allowed to do it, than saying anyone and everyone can. But as I say, that is to some extent to do with the way I've kind of grown up and been trained, and my desire not to be party political. I have heard things said by some of my charity CEO colleagues that I think have crossed a line and been too party political. Because they judge there to be a kind of coincidence of view between what they are saying and thinking and standing for and what a political party is saying at any moment in time. And I do find that uncomfortable, and I think it's a bit naive as well, because there are different ways of addressing issues depending on your political worldview. But but there we are. I mean, the IEA.
Go on. Yes,
the IEA are an interesting case, though, aren't they? So, without becoming the Charity Commission, so they are a think tank which promotes the value of a market-based theory of how to
basically
achieve change, and
capitalism, which is a political ideology,
and they are advancing the education and knowledge and understanding of market-based solutions in a range of contexts. And I think that is there's another question about whether particular types of think tank that take a particular view of the world are charitable organizations or not. And that's not a left wing or a right wing.
No.
That's a kind of narrow versus broad approach. Now, I think that there are personally quite a number of broad context in which it is fascinating to advance the knowledge and understanding of what happens if you bring a market-based approach to a particular issue. Where it becomes complicated is when it connects with some of the other things that you said the Good Law Project were criticizing the IEA for, about where is their money coming from, and do they have predetermined policy positions influenced by the people that are giving them the money, which we don't know about, in a manner which is less about education and more about the advancement of a political agenda. And that to me wouldn't be charitable. But the challenge is, not really knowing who is funding them and what the motivation is behind that. So the Charity Commission says some pretty clear things about the value and importance of being transparent with your funding. You're supposed to break down your income. You're supposed to identify significant donors and be clear about any conflicts or special interests there. I mean, this is all set out in the so it does seem to me, and I had a quick look at the IEA's last set of published accounts, and it is very difficult to understand quite who is funding them for what purpose. So they could do themselves a favor by being more open about all of that and remove some of these criticisms which people are making of their approach, which may be genuine concern for the application of charitable law, or maybe party political attacks themselves because they don't like market-based solutions to public policy questions.
I think it's interesting, actually. There's a couple of things popped to mind there. So the interesting thing about promoting market-based solutions for whose purpose, for whose benefit, I think that's probably where the clashes come. Because if you think about, there's a huge amount of social issues that market-based solutions are not the answer. And we have the evidence for that. Look at children's homes, look at care homes, look at social care. Like, there's a whole range of things where homes, for example, where if you leave the market to have free reign, you end up with more people homeless. You get loads of rich people with properties, etc., and so on. I mean, I'm skating over the evidence a bit here, but there's that broad thing. So I suppose there are arguments about, should they just be promoting that one view if it's at the cost of a particular, given that we're supposed to be for public benefit as charities generally. I mean, I don't have the answer to that. I'm just saying, I think these are big questions to be asked about it. And also, there's sort of the question about, because I think think tanks are probably a good thing. I think if you can raise money to just sit and think, that's good, because the reality is most of us doing the work don't have time to think. We're so busy saving lives or saving communities or what have you. So it is quite handy to have those places where they do the research and they do the thinking and they come up with their ideas. So I'm not against that specifically. I don't have a problem with think tanks being charities. I do think, however, there's an issue if it isn't really clear that the think tank that's being presented to you isn't independent, that it has a particular take on things. And I think that's what annoys people, is that,
and sometimes these think tanks are then their own worst enemies, because they potentially overstate their influence on the world. So when the Trust Kwarteng mini budget exploded, and there was lots of kind of cheering from the rafters in Tufton Street and the IEA and all of that sort of stuff, because at last here was a budget which was based on their worldview. I expect they themselves would say they didn't say that or associate themselves quite as closely with that, but that would be if there was that kind of direct connection between their thinking and the delivery of the budget, that would be a problem.
The thing is, you can always tell, though, Peter, because you only have to look at things like Question Time. So Question Time, which tries to get an even panel, people from the right, people from the left, different political parties, and anybody from the IEA is always there presenting the sort of more hard right view of the world. I mean, that's you can actually see visibly sometimes
market-based
evidence.
View. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Yes, you can call it that.
The one that gets my goat a bit in this space is the Taxpayers Alliance.
Oh, right, okay.
Because as a former private secretary to the chief secretary in the Treasury, and I'd spent most of my 20s sort of trying to help ministers control public expenditure, I do think of myself very much as the taxpayers' friend. But the Taxpayers Alliance seems to take a particular interest in some very narrow types of public spending, like, for example, the salaries of local authority chief executives.
Oh, yes.
But seems to take a lot less interest in PPE scandals and the like, which cost an awful lot more taxpayers' money than some of these other things. So there, I would have some questions about. It's all. Are you applying your purpose with consistency across the range of issues, or do you have predetermined policy positions or a kind of worldview which you're advancing irrespective of the evidence or the context? And that does seem to me to be against what the Charity Commission says these sorts of organisations should be doing. But it's a view, and I'm not the Charity Commissioner.
Yeah, of course, and they will do their investigation. They'll publish a report, and whatever they conclude, somebody won't be happy. So it's one of those no-win situations, isn't it? Whereas if they conclude that they're not complying with charity law, a whole load of people go absolutely bonkers and say that's really unfair and they've overreached. And if they say they are, a whole load of other people will go absolutely bonkers and say that they're wrong. So I don't envy the Commission in this space, to be perfectly honest with you, because, they're certainly not going to please everybody. But then I suppose regulators don't, do they? If they're having to apply charity law, they just have to apply what the law says and then look for evidence that either been complied with or not.
Your point about the regime which businesses work under is also interesting in relation to the extent to which brands have chosen both to associate themselves with so-called wokery and to race away from wokery. And there are some there are some interesting questions about either what they should or shouldn't be able to do legally in this space, which you're posing the question about. There's also something about the wider context in which they operate and the extent to which it makes good or bad business sense to associate with a particular set of values, or irrespective of the business sense, whether that is something which brands could or should do. And we would find people across the political spectrum who kind of love and hate that, depending on the particular brand and the particular stance which they're taking at any moment in time.
So maybe that's what we should campaign for, Peter, that the law should apply to businesses as well as charities, so there's no unfair advantage.
or it shouldn't apply at all, or a lot less. Deregulate the whole thing and become and all get a bit more chilled about it.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's no particular conclusion there, but really interested to have a view, because, as I said, I veer, from one side to the other when I'm thinking about this. The other thing that's been exercising me is this. So there'll be information published very shortly about trusts and foundations and what they give and how they give and what proportion of their money is given away and what proportion is reinvested, etc. And this is every time this sort of informational data is published, it generally raises this issue about should there be a mandatory limit or mandatory minimum spend that trusts and foundations should make, which they have, of course. They have in the States, in Canada, and I think Australia, where they have to spend a certain proportion of their income.
5%, I think.
Yeah, something like that, on charitable causes. Anyway, this idea keeps rearing its, I'm going to say ugly head, because I'm not a fan of this idea, but keeps rearing its ugly head in the UK. And I'm interested in your view about that. I mean, I'm, you know, for me, it's like, it's a level of interference in the independence of charities that I don't think is appropriate. You know, we appoint trustees to charities. We trust them, you know, the clue's in the name, to apply the resources of that charity in furtherance of their charitable objects, you know, to support their beneficiaries, whoever they happen to be. And I think dictating, you know, what they should and shouldn't, how much they should and shouldn't spend, I think is a very blunt tool. So I have a number of issues with this idea, you know, this notion of mandated minimums. You know, a few of them are the really obvious ones. For example, trustees are given the right in law to make decisions about their charitable assets and resources on behalf of the rest of the organisation, and we would go mad if we were mandated with fundraising spends or how many staff you're allowed to employ and stuff like that. And I don't think this is really very much any different. You know, this is about the freedom and the independence of the charity to make its own decisions about things. It's a really important principle of charity regulation. It's also, you know, I think it's also disguising the real problem, because this tends to crop up because charities are struggling for funding, which they are. You know, many of us are on our knees at the moment. And so what happens is everybody turns to trusts and foundations rather than looking at, you know, what is the problem? What's going on here? Actually, and it's a more systemic problem about the state not funding certain things that the state probably ought to be funding in one way, shape or form, either because in law they have to fund it or because it's a psychological contract with the citizens that you will fund this sort of work and that's what my tax is going to. And so I think that it's a distraction to say, you know, we need to put the pressure on trusts and foundations to spend more, because even if they do, you know, they only contribute about 10% of the whole of the sector's income. And there's absolutely no way, even if you were to mandate a minimum spend, that would plug anywhere near the hole that's left by by the loss of public funding for certain really critical causes. But I think the biggest thing for me is there's a thing called it's called the centre stage effect, Peter. I don't know if you've come across it, but it's the theory that's used by restaurants in their wine menus. So if you go into a restaurant, you will find that you have a range of cheaper wines, a range of really expensive ones, and some in the middle. And the ones in the middle are generally the most profitable. They've got the biggest margins on them. The reason being is because most people choose the item in the middle. And there's been loads and loads and loads of psychological tests on all sorts of different things. And people are drawn to choose what's in the middle for whatever reason that is. And what that worries me about is that if we do mandate trusts and foundations, say you've got to spend, I don't know, let's say 5%, there's a very strong possibility that will become what they actually spend. So we have to spend 5%. So it will limit what they give away rather than free up, because they'll think, well, we don't need to do more than 5%. We'll just do that. We've met our 5%. That's fine. But I think it will have an unintended effect and actually reduce the overall amount of income into the sector. And also it takes away flexibility. There are always going to be times when, for whatever reason, a trust foundation needs to not spend in a particular year, either because they're doing something about investing for a longer term project, or they've made really big long-term commitments. They've got to make sure they've got the money to cover because they promised 5-year funding or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, I'm not a fan of the idea, Peter. What do you think?
So it's my understanding that in the countries where there is a specified minimum distribution, 5% in the States, for sure, it's tied up in a kind of wider regime to do with gift aid, tax relief on philanthropic donations and all the rest of it. So it's part of a kind of wider picture. And without the minimum distribution, you would find that people who are investing their money into the trusts and foundations, all the gain would be theirs at the expense of the cause that they're seeking to support. So I kind of My starting point would be the money belongs to the people who have put the money in the trusts and foundations, and yes, it should be for them to decide how little or how much they want to distribute at any moment in time. Except that I think there are examples of ego-driven foundations where people are setting things up, getting all the public credit for being associated in a kind of vague sense with doing good, but actually the money then sits in the bank, generates interest, and doesn't actually further in the short to medium term the charitable purpose which the trust or foundation is getting all the credit for being set up to be associated with. So I am sympathetic to there being an explicit, consideration of how these trusts and foundations are actually achieving what it is they're setting out to do. And if all they're doing is kind of raising money for some unspecified point in the future, that's not very good. If they're an endowment fund which has a clear short, medium, and long-term ambition to achieve something, and by regulating the pace of their spend, they are going to achieve more than just spending the money as soon as it comes in.
Yeah,
that sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, well, the thing about our country, of course, is we have a very sophisticated, long developed set of a regulatory environment for charities, and actually is actually quite hard for charities to hoard money unnecessarily, because in law, trustees are required in law to disperse their resources in furtherance of their objects unless they can justify why they haven't. So, for example, lots of people don't realise this, but there's no requirement to have reserves in your charity. It's perfectly legal to not have any, but you have to explain why you haven't got any. And if you've got a large number of reserves, the trustees are required to explain why they've hung on to that number of reserves. So if a charity is, for whatever reason, hoarding, that would easily trigger an investigation by the Charity Commission, who would come in and require the evidence and the detail about why this hoarding of wealth had happened, which is, and also, of course, in UK charity law, which is different to, in fact, I don't even think they have charity law in the States, do they? It's all done under their general tax system. But under charity law, trustees are required to be independent of any outside influences, including those who give the money. So unless when you set up the trust or foundation, you specified the endowment was for a particular thing, then the trustees are free to spend that money on whatever, regardless of what you, the donating person, unless you're giving it as a restricted fund, which is different. And even then, the trustees still have the duty to disperse that thing. So I think that the things that people are afraid of in our sector, I think don't really happen and unlikely to happen, because we have a very robust regulatory environment and a very robust protection for charities. So if the donor does say, this is how I want my money spent, unless they've done it restricted, actually tough. You've donated money and the trustees are going to independently make decisions in the best interest of the charity. So I think it's a bit of a hammer to crack a nut that actually doesn't need cracking.
Have there been examples of trusts and foundations being, criticised and penalised for not distributing their money, but simply building up and building up and building up money? I don't know. I do. Going back to my time at lottery, recall endless, usually Daily Mail stories criticising us for sitting on very large balances instead of distributing the money to the charities who we were there to benefit, which was a complete misreading of the situation, because like a bank, the lottery spends money, commits money against its balances well out into the future, presuming that people are going to buy lottery tickets out to the future. So it's quite easy to look at the lottery's accounts and say, oh, they're sitting on these hundreds of millions of pounds of money, they should give it all away now. But
it's committed for the future.
More than 2 or 3 times committed. So so I know that was a misreading, but I don't know if there are some trusts and foundations who are simply they're saying it's back to my kind of theoretical example earlier, I suppose, saying that they're doing great stuff, but actually aren't doing very much at all. In which case, what are they
actually doing
to require them to either disperse their money or
charity law, basically. The commission can come in and inspect, and the trustees will have to be able to justify why they haven't, dispersed income that the others shouldn't. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, like lots and lots of trusts and foundations have endowments, which in law they're required to protect because that's how it's been, and so they can only spend the interest. And there are other charities where other trusts actually, because of course this applies to individuals too, where they're allowed to accumulate money over a period of time before they then disperse the money. So there are loopholes around it. But and there may well be people, like you just gave the example of lottery. There may well be people who are accused of hoarding money, but nothing springs to mind. I don't recall in the last 25 years a charity commission inquiry into a charity saying you're not spending your money, please go and spend it. Although it may have happened and it just didn't, hit the public eye. So I'm not aware that it's a real problem, to be fair.
So this could be, as they say, a solution in search of a problem.
Which is what I think. I think, I think our time would be much better spent anyway asking the bigger question is, should charities be subsidising the state? Should we be using charitable money to cover holes in state spending, which happens particularly, of course, at local level?
That's a massive question.
I know. We haven't got time for it today.
No, because that then gets into what should the state be doing and not be doing, and maybe in your view of the world, the state should be running the lifeboat service, but it never has, and it's never had to. So,
and that's not my view at all, actually, because I think loads of things should be. But I do think there are some. Anyway, I think this would be a brilliant discussion for another podcast, Peter, where we can explore this idea about what should the state fund and what shouldn't the state fund, and sort of take it from there. But I'm really conscious we've run out of time.
Something for the next 30 episodes.
Yes. Anybody with any views, by all means, send them in. We're always interested. That
would be great. All right, then.
Okay.
Well, enjoy the week.
And you too, Peter. And next week.
See you next time. Yeah.
Bye. Bye.